Dr. Ethan Caldwell was the kind of man people pointed at when they wanted to describe success. At 35, he was already a leading surgeon in Houston, a city famous for its world-class medical centers. His name carried weight in operating rooms at Houston Methodist and the Texas Medical Center. Colleagues respected his precision and calm authority. Patients trusted him with their lives, and the medical community knew him as one of the best. On paper, Ethan had everything: skill, wealth, a reputation many would envy, and the kind of career that only relentless discipline could build. He lived in a 2-story modern home on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a place that mirrored his taste for order and clean lines. Every detail of his days was organized with the same care he applied in surgery. He woke before dawn, worked out with military precision, and arrived at the hospital before most had poured their first cup of coffee. In the evenings, he didn't collapse into a couch like so many of his peers. He preferred activity, running along Buffalo Bayou, riding horses when he could find time, skiing on winter trips, and, more than anything, fishing. Fishing wasn't just a hobby, it was his meditation, his way of silencing the noise of a city that never stopped humming. Ethan loved the simplicity of a rod, a line, and the stillness of a lake more than any expensive party he could be invited to. Despite his physical discipline and polished appearance, his private life was a blank page. Rumors circulated among nurses and even some of his colleagues. How could a man like him still be single? Some whispered that he was indifferent to women. Others speculated crueler things about his masculinity. Ethan never bothered to deny or confirm any of it. He wasn't ashamed, nor was he inclined to prove himself to anyone. His victories, personal or professional, were his own business. The truth was far simpler. He had dated, he had experienced fleeting romances, but none of them had lasted, and he never felt compelled to announce them. Relationships came and went, and for Ethan, they had never filled the empty space he carried with him. That emptiness had roots stretching back to childhood. Ethan's parents, both highly respected doctors, were brilliant but perpetually absent. His father was a cardiologist often called into emergency procedures. His mother, an oncologist, traveled frequently for conferences and spent long nights on call. For Ethan, home was a place of quiet rooms and hurried meals. He was left mostly with his grandmother, a stern woman who provided food and discipline but little warmth. She dressed him neatly, ensured his homework was done, and sent him to school on time, but affection was scarce. Ethan grew up learning not to expect hugs or tender words. By the time he was in middle school, he was accustomed to solitude. He cooked simple meals for himself, kept the house tidy, and rarely complained. If he invited a girl over, no one noticed. If he stayed out late, no one waited up. Independence wasn't a choice, it was a survival skill. As a young man, Ethan poured his energy into academics and then into medicine. He graduated with honors, completed his residency with distinction, and built a career step by step, each achievement stacked on top of the last. There were setbacks, of course: grueling hours, failed relationships, the endless exhaustion of medical training. But he endured them the way he endured long hours in the OR, silently, without complaint, driven by a goal he could never quite articulate. He told himself it was about being the best, about saving lives, but deep down he knew it was also about filling the silence inside him with something that mattered. Now, in his mid-30s, Ethan's life looked enviable to outsiders. He drove a sleek black Lexus, wore suits tailored in downtown boutiques, and enjoyed every comfort money could provide. Yet when he returned home at night, silence greeted him. The refrigerator hummed, the house stood immaculate, and no one asked how his day had gone. He told himself he preferred it that way, that freedom was worth more than attachment. But sometimes, while casting a line over still water or looking at the lights of the city from his balcony, he wondered what all of it was for. He was admired, even envied. But admiration is not companionship, and envy is not love. Ethan Caldwell, the brilliant surgeon of Houston, seemed to have everything a man could want, except someone to share it with. And in those quiet moments, he felt the hollowness most of all. Outside the bright glass doors of a Houston supermarket, Dr. Ethan Caldwell slowed his steps. The April air was unseasonably cold, sharp with wind that cut down the street and slipped beneath his tailored coat. He had stopped on his way home to grab a few things, a routine errand that should have taken minutes. But on the bench near the entrance, a scene pulled him from his stride. A young woman sat huddled with a boy of about 7, both clutching their thin jackets tighter against the chill. The boy's knees were drawn up, his sneakers scuffed, his shoulders trembling, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. The woman, barely out of her 20s, kept glancing at him, her face pale with worry. Ethan noticed the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, trying to smile for the boy, though her eyes betrayed a deep weariness. Something about the pair stopped him. He wasn't in the habit of intervening in strangers' lives, but the contrast between the warmth of the supermarket's lights and the two figures outside was stark. They weren't waiting for anyone. They looked stranded. He approached gently, not wanting to startle them. "Are you two all right?" he asked. His voice carried the calm tone he often used with nervous patients. The woman hesitated before answering. "We're fine," she murmured, though the boy's lips were blue with cold. Ethan crouched slightly to meet the boy's gaze. That was when he noticed it, the uneven way the child's legs were positioned, the subtle favoring of one side. "Your leg," Ethan said softly. "What happened?" The boy looked at his mother, uncertain if he should answer. She exhaled, then admitted, "He fell off a bike months ago. It hasn't healed right. We haven't been able to see a doctor." It was a statement heavy with subtext. In Houston, where hospitals towered like monuments, the only reason a child wouldn't be seen was money. Ethan's chest tightened. He had treated countless children for injuries far less severe, families with insurance that covered every detail. But here was a boy limping through pain because his mother had no means. He straightened, running a hand over his jaw as an idea formed. This wasn't just pity, it was instinct. He had room in his home, the resources, and, if he was honest with himself, an ache for company. "Look," he began, carefully addressing the woman. "I know this might sound unusual. My name's Ethan Caldwell. I'm a surgeon here in Houston. I live alone, and I've been considering hiring someone to help keep up my house. It's large and I work long hours. If you're looking for work, I could use a housekeeper." The woman blinked at him, startled. "You don't even know me," she said. "You're right," Ethan admitted. "But I can see you're in a difficult situation. And I can promise you this. I'm not the kind of man who would hurt you or your son. You'd have a roof over your head, steady income, and safety. I can also make sure your boy gets the medical care he needs." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the shuffle of carts and the automatic doors sliding open and shut. The boy's small hand slipped into hers, as if asking her to consider. She drew a breath. "I'm Grace Miller, and this is Danny." Ethan nodded, relieved at the first step of trust. "It's good to meet you, Grace. What do you think?" Grace looked down at her son, then back at the man who seemed too polished, too composed to be real. Everything about her screamed caution. She knew the dangers women faced when desperate. But she also saw the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet steadiness that belonged to someone used to holding lives in his hands. Finally, she whispered, "All right, we'll come." That night, Ethan carried groceries into his immaculate house, and behind him trailed Grace and Danny. The boy's eyes widened at the spacious rooms, the glow of warmth, the stocked kitchen. Grace moved carefully, still uncertain if this was the right choice, but already grateful that her son was no longer shivering outside. It was an arrangement born of chance, but as Ethan watched them settle in, Grace's cautious steps Danny's hesitant smile. He felt a stirring he hadn't expected. The silence that once welcomed him home was broken, replaced by the faint sound of life. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment marked the beginning of a bond that would change all of their lives. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt strange at first, but gradually began to feel natural. Grace moved through Ethan's large house with quiet determination, tidying rooms that had once stood untouched for weeks, cooking meals that warmed the air with scents Ethan hadn't realized he missed. She was careful not to intrude on his space, always asking before adjusting anything. But Ethan noticed small differences immediately. The laundry folded, the kitchen counters gleaming, fresh linens on his bed. Danny, too, changed within days, no longer confined to the cold or to meager meals. The boy's cheeks flushed with color, and his eyes brightened with curiosity. He marveled at Ethan's collection of medical books, touching the spines with reverence, and often sat at the wide windows overlooking the street, watching the world go by as though it were a movie. Ethan was gone most of the day, immersed in surgeries, consultations, and the unending hum of hospital life. Yet each evening when he returned, there was a subtle shift. The house, once echoing with silence, now greeted him with the clatter of pans or the murmur of Grace's voice reading softly to Danny. The loneliness he had carried so long began to recede, though he didn't dare name the feeling. Still, Ethan remained cautious. He treated Grace with a professional courtesy, as though she were a colleague rather than a housekeeper. He thanked her for meals, nodded his approval at the order she maintained, but never crossed into personal territory. She mirrored his restraint, keeping their conversations polite and measured. It was not romance. It was a truce of sorts, two adults carefully navigating unfamiliar ground. But Ethan's attention was repeatedly drawn to Danny. He couldn't ignore the boy's limp, the way he shifted uncomfortably when walking too far, or the subtle wince when he thought no one was looking. For a surgeon like Ethan, the signs were unmistakable. The leg hadn't healed properly. Without intervention, the child's future would be burdened with pain and limitations. One evening, Ethan returned earlier than usual. He found Danny on the back patio, a sketchpad balanced on his lap, drawing crooked lines that slowly formed into a crude fishing rod and a fish. Ethan smiled faintly. "You like fishing?" he asked. Danny looked up, startled, then nodded. "My mom told me about it. I've never gone." Ethan sat down beside him, his gaze drifting to the boy's leg. "You'd like it," he said, "but it's not much fun if you can't run to the water or stand steady on the bank." The boy's expression faltered, his small hand tightening on the pencil. Ethan's chest tightened in response. In that moment, the thought solidified he had to help. Not out of obligation, not even out of pity, but because he could, and because the boy deserved more than a life of limping through childhood. Inside, Grace set the table, glancing toward the patio window. She saw Ethan sitting with Danny and felt a cautious warmth in her chest. It wasn't that she trusted him fully yet. Life had taught her to be wary. But she saw something in Ethan's posture, the way he leaned just enough to listen, the way Danny's usual guardedness softened in his presence. Later that night, Ethan lingered in the kitchen after dinner, rinsing his plate while Grace dried the dishes. "He needs treatment," Ethan said quietly, almost to himself. Grace stiffened. "I know, but it's expensive." "We couldn't," her voice trailed off, heavy with resignation. Ethan didn't press further, not yet. Instead, he nodded, filing away the certainty that he would do something. He didn't want to frighten her with promises she wasn't ready to accept. But the thought stayed with him, clear and immovable, long after the house grew quiet. In the days that followed, their lives continued in the same delicate balance. Grace kept the home running smoothly. Danny began to laugh more, exploring the rooms as though they belonged to him, and Ethan adjusted to the background hum of family life. It was still formal, still restrained, but a foundation had been laid. For the first time in years, Ethan's house felt less like a polished museum and more like a place where people actually lived. He hadn't expected it, but when he walked through the door each evening, the silence he once embraced was no longer there, and he found he didn't miss it at all. Late one evening, Ethan returned from the hospital and dropped his keys on the counter, expecting the usual quiet. Grace had already put Danny to bed, and the house was wrapped in a peaceful stillness. He had barely settled into his chair when his phone rang. The name flashing on the screen tugged at memories he hadn't revisited in years. Paul Kramer, an old classmate from high school. Ethan Caldwell. The familiar voice boomed as soon as he answered. Man, it's been forever. You still slicing people open for a living? Ethan chuckled. Cardiac surgery, Paul. Not as crude as you make it sound. Same difference, Paul teased. Listen, the old crew's putting together a reunion. 20 years since we graduated. We're all meeting next month. Everyone's bringing their spouses. You'll be there, right? The question was simple, casual, but it froze Ethan in place. Spouses, wives, husbands. He hesitated, pride colliding with truth. He should have just said he was single, but the words slipped out before he could stop himself. Of course, my wife, and I wouldn't miss it. There was silence on the other end for a beat, then Paul let out a laugh. You old dog, I didn't even know you tied the knot. Can't wait to meet her. Ethan forced a smile that no one could see. Yeah, she's great. After the call ended, Ethan set the phone down and cursed under his breath. Why had he said that? It was one thing to be single at 35, but among classmates who had all built families, he didn't want to stand there alone, the odd man out. Pride had spoken for him. Now he had to deal with it. The next morning, he caught sight of Grace wiping down the kitchen counters. Danny was at the table, bent over a coloring book. Ethan cleared his throat. Grace, can I talk to you for a moment? She looked up, immediately wary. Of course. Did I do something wrong? No, not at all. He gestured toward the study, and she followed, nervously smoothing her apron as she sat on the edge of a chair. Ethan remained standing, hands shoved into his pockets. I received a call last night. There's a reunion for my old class. Everyone will be bringing their spouses. I may have told them I was married. Grace blinked. You told them what? He exhaled. It just slipped out, and now they're expecting me to show up with a wife. I was wondering if you would be willing to play the part, just for one evening. Her eyes widened, and she almost laughed at the absurdity. You want me to pretend to be your wife? Yes, Ethan admitted. I'll compensate you, of course. You wouldn't have to do much. Just stand by my side, smile, exchange pleasantries. Then it's over. No one there will ever see you again. Grace folded her arms, shaking her head. Ethan, that's crazy. What if people see through it? I'm not. She stopped herself, biting down on the words. Not sophisticated. Not polished enough. That was what she almost said. I'll make sure no one does, he promised quickly. I'll provide a dress, take you to a salon. You won't have to worry about a thing. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Grace looked down at her hands. Danny needed stability, and she owed Ethan for giving them shelter. Still, the thought of pretending to be a man's wife, standing among strangers who belonged to his world, terrified her. And Danny, she asked, her voice soft. He'll be fine for a few hours, Ethan said. I'll arrange for someone trustworthy to stay with him. It's only one night. The silence stretched until finally, with a resigned sigh, Grace nodded. All right, I'll do it, but only because I don't want to make things worse for you. Relief washed over Ethan's face. Thank you. Truly. True to his word, the next week he returned home carrying a box from a boutique. Inside lay a gown the color of clear summer skies, its fabric threaded with subtle shimmer. Grace hesitated before lifting it from the tissue paper, her fingers trembling as she held it against herself. "It's too much," she whispered. "It's perfect," Ethan corrected, his eyes warm with approval. "Wait until you see it on." On the evening of the reunion, he drove her to one of Houston's finest salons. Grace sat in the chair, stiff with nerves, while stylists worked their magic. Her hair was pinned into an elegant updo, makeup brushed in soft tones that highlighted her natural features. When she finally stepped out of the salon toward the car, Ethan was waiting by the curb. For a man who prided himself on composure, he forgot himself for a moment. His jaw slackened, and his eyes widened as though he were seeing her for the first time. Grace flushed under his gaze, gripping the folds of her gown. "What?" she asked nervously. He shook his head, a slow smile spreading. "Nothing. Just you look incredible." For Grace, who had lived years feeling invisible, the words sank deep. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her in the salon mirror. Refined, luminous, nothing like the exhausted mother who had once huddled on a bench outside a supermarket. And though she told herself it was all pretense, that this night would mean nothing more, a quiet part of her couldn't help but wonder if this transformation might be more than just skin deep. The banquet hall glittered with chandeliers and soft music, the kind of venue Ethan's classmates had chosen to remind each other how far they had come since high school. Men wore tailored suits, women dressed in elegant gowns, and conversations hummed with stories of careers, families, and vacations abroad. When Ethan entered with Grace on his arm, the atmosphere shifted. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. For a moment, it was as though the entire room inhaled at once. Grace, draped in the sapphire gown and glowing from the careful touch of the stylists, seemed like someone who had always belonged in such a place. Her posture was nervous, her fingers tightening around Ethan's arm. But to everyone else, she looked like elegance personified. "Ethan Caldwell," Paul Kramer boomed, striding over with a wide grin. "And this must be your wife." His eyes lingered a second too long on Grace before he pulled Ethan into a hearty embrace. "This is Grace," Ethan said smoothly, his voice carrying quiet pride. He hadn't realized until that moment how natural it felt to introduce her that way. Grace smiled politely, offering a soft handshake. Compliments rained down almost immediately. "She's stunning." "Where have you been hiding her, Ethan?" "You always had good taste." The wives of his classmates exchanged glances, some smiling politely, others whispering with thinly veiled envy. Grace felt the weight of their eyes and flushed, lowering her gaze. She wasn't used to attention, let alone admiration. She had walked into this night expecting to be painfully out of place. Instead, she was the one being noticed. Ethan guided her through the crowd with ease, introducing her to old friends and colleagues, each introduction reinforcing the illusion. But even to him, it didn't feel entirely like pretense anymore. There was a warmth in his chest when he caught her laughing shyly at a compliment, or when he noticed how the light caught in her hair. He hadn't expected this night to feel real, but it did. Later, as the band struck up a familiar tune, Paul clapped Ethan on the back. "You've got to dance with her. Don't keep her sitting here while the rest of us make fools of ourselves." Ethan turned to Grace, offering his hand. "May I?" She hesitated, glancing at the couples already swaying across the polished floor. "I'm not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Ethan replied with a small smile. "But no one here will notice." Grace allowed him to lead her to the dance floor. His hand rested lightly at her waist, her fingers tentatively clasping his shoulder. At first, her movements were stiff, self-conscious, but Ethan's steady presence anchored her. He moved with calm assurance, guiding her gently until she found the rhythm. Slowly, her nerves gave way to something unexpected, comfort. As they turned beneath the golden lights, Grace lifted her eyes to his and found him already watching her. It wasn't the practiced gaze of a man showing off his partner for social points. It was softer, more searching, as though he was trying to memorize the way she looked at that very moment. Heat rose in her cheeks, and she looked away quickly, but the flutter in her chest lingered. Around them, whispers floated through the air. Caldwell really outdid himself. "She's beautiful." I didn't know he had it in him. The admiration only intensified Grace's unease. But beneath it all, she felt a flicker of pride. For once, she wasn't the struggling woman scraping by, invisible to the world. She was someone people noticed, someone who belonged at the side of a man like Ethan. When the music slowed, Ethan leaned close, his voice low. "You're doing wonderfully." Grace laughed softly, her nerves spilling out as humor. "For someone who's supposed to be pretending, you sound awfully convincing." His lips curved, maybe because it doesn't feel like pretending. She froze, her heart tripping over itself. It was just a line, she told herself, just a way to keep up appearances. Yet when she dared to meet his gaze again, she saw no calculation there, only sincerity, and that unsettled her more than anything. The song ended, and applause rippled through the room. Ethan guided her back to their table, his hand lingering at the small of her back a moment longer than necessary. Grace sat down, flustered, but a shy smile tugged at her lips. She had stepped into this night expecting nothing but awkwardness, a role to play until the charade was over. Instead, she felt a spark, something fragile, something dangerous, something real. And though neither of them knew it yet, this fragile spark would be the first step toward truths that could no longer stay hidden. The morning after the reunion, Paul insisted on giving Ethan and Grace a short tour of the school before they left. It was partly nostalgia, partly pride, and eagerness to show how the old building had been preserved. Grace followed beside Ethan, still in awe of the evening before, her hand brushing lightly against the sleeve of his jacket. She had expected ridicule, but had received admiration instead. For a fleeting night, she had felt transformed. The halls of the school carried the faint scent of polished wood and old paper. Posters of graduating classes lined the walls, photographs of smiling faces framed in glass. Grace's pace slowed as her eyes wandered across the images. Each year seemed a frozen moment in time, familiar yet distant. Then she stopped abruptly. Her breath caught, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. On a memorial board dedicated to students who had passed too young, a face stared back at her. One she could never forget, Laura Miller, her sister. Tears sprang instantly to Grace's eyes. Her chest tightened as if the air had been stolen from the hallway. "Laura!" she whispered, the name breaking on her lips. Ethan turned, alarmed by the sudden change in her voice. He followed her gaze to the photograph. A young woman, smiling gently, framed by flowers and a small plaque that marked her death at 22. His heart lurched violently, his stomach hollowing as recognition struck him like a blow. Laura. The name echoed in his mind, pulling him back to a summer years ago. A fishing trip at a quiet lake outside the city. She had been there, bright, full of laughter, eyes sparkling in the sun as she teased him about his poor casting technique. They had spent days talking, walking the banks of the water, sharing stories like old friends though they had just met. Their connection had been sudden, fierce, unforgettable. He had left that trip convinced he would see her again. But life, residency, and distance had pulled him away. He had never sought her out, telling himself that fate would bring them together if it was meant to be. And now, fate had shown him her face again on a memorial board. He stood frozen, his throat thick, his pulse hammering in his ears. Grace sobbed quietly, her shoulders trembling as she traced her sister's name on the plaque. "She died during childbirth," she choked out. "She didn't make it. I promised I'd take care of her baby. Danny. He's mine now, but really he's hers." Danny. The name thundered in Ethan's mind. His vision blurred as pieces slammed into place with terrifying clarity. Laura, that summer, the brief but undeniable intimacy they had shared, the timing of her pregnancy. Danny. Ethan swayed, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Could it be possible? Could the boy who laughed in his home, who limped through the halls with stubborn bravery, be his son? He forced himself to breathe, to hide the storm ripping through him. Grace was still crying, oblivious to the turmoil inside him. He stepped closer, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. I'm so sorry, Grace, he murmured, his voice raw. I didn't know. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. No one could have known. I was there when she passed. I was the only one left to care for him. I didn't want him to end up in foster care, so I raised him as my own. It hasn't been easy, but he's all I have. Ethan swallowed hard, fighting to keep his composure. He wanted to speak, to confess the memories flooding him, but the words tangled in his throat. How could he tell her? How could he explain that her sister's child might not just be her responsibility, but his own flesh and blood? They left the school soon after, Grace leaning into Ethan's quiet support, her grief raw and unguarded. He walked beside her in silence, each step heavy with revelation. His mind reeled, torn between shock and guilt. He had let Laura slip away once, never realizing what was lost. Now, standing in the shadow of her death, he faced the unthinkable possibility that her child, Grace's son, was his. That night, long after Grace had gone to bed and the house had grown silent, Ethan sat alone in his study. His hands trembled as he pressed them together, his thoughts circling relentlessly. Danny's face rose in his mind, his smile, his stubborn courage, his fragile leg that needed healing. The resemblance he had dismissed before now haunted him. The truth loomed over him, undeniable and terrifying. Danny Miller might be his son, and Ethan Caldwell, the man who had spent his life mastering control, suddenly felt as though the ground beneath him had given way. The drive back from the school was heavy with silence. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, still shaken from the shock of seeing Laura's face on the memorial wall. Her eyes were red, her cheeks streaked with tears she hadn't yet managed to wipe away. Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the road, but his knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. Every mile brought him closer to a decision he knew he couldn't postpone. At last, unable to bear the weight pressing down on him, he spoke. "Grace," he began, his voice low and unsteady. "There's something I need to tell you." She turned slightly, her face guarded. "What is it?" He drew a slow breath, searching for words that could carry the truth without crushing her. "Years ago, before residency consumed my life, I took a trip outside the city. I went fishing by a lake not far from here, and I met someone. Her name was Laura." His voice faltered on the name. "She was unforgettable. We spent a few days together, talking, laughing, sitting by the water. It was brief, but it felt real." Grace's lips parted, her expression caught between disbelief and pain. "I thought about her afterward," Ethan continued, his throat tight, "but then work pulled me back. I told myself it had only been a fleeting thing. I didn't look for her. I should have. God, I should have. And now," his hands trembled as they tightened on the wheel, "now I know the woman I left behind was your sister." The car felt suddenly smaller, suffocating. Grace shook her head, slowly, tears spilling anew. "So all this time, Danny!" Ethan forced himself to meet her gaze for a moment before turning back to the road. "I don't know for certain, but if Laura was pregnant after that summer, if the timing fits, then yes, it's possible he's mine." Her breath hitched as she turned away, staring out the window at the blur of passing lights. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? For years, I've carried him as my own, fought for him when no one else would. And now Now you're telling me he might be your son." The anguish in her voice pierced him. "I don't want to take him from you," Ethan said quickly. "You've been his mother in every way that matters. I would never try to erase that. But if he's my son, Grace, don't I owe him the truth? Don't I owe him the chance at a future with every resource I can give?" Her shoulders shook, torn between fury and despair. "You don't get it. For me, Danny is more than responsibility. He's everything. He's all I have left of Laura. If this is true, if he's yours, what happens then? Where does that leave me?" Ethan slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. He turned to her fully, his eyes raw with emotion. "It leaves you where you've always been, at the center of his life. Nothing changes that. But I can't walk away, Grace. Not now. Not knowing what I know." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the hum of the engine and Grace's uneven breathing filled the air. At last, she whispered, "How can we even be sure?" "There's a way," Ethan said firmly. "A DNA test. Simple, conclusive. No guessing. If Danny is mine, we'll know." Grace hesitated, the thought almost too much to bear. But deep inside, she knew the boy deserved the truth, however painful it might be. After a long silence, she nodded faintly. "Then do it. But promise me, no matter what the result says, you won't take him away from me." Ethan's voice broke as he answered, "I swear, Grace, I would never do that." The following week passed in a haze. Ethan arranged for the test quietly, ensuring it was done with discretion. Grace carried herself with the weight of dread, torn between hope and fear. Danny, blissfully unaware, continued with his drawings and small joys, limping through the house with determination. When the results finally arrived, Ethan opened the envelope alone, his breath shallow, his heart pounding as though he were about to perform the most delicate surgery of his life. One glance at the paper told him everything. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. His knees went weak, and he sank into a chair, the document shaking in his hands. Danny was his son, flesh of his flesh, a bond that could no longer be denied. Later, when he showed Grace the results, she pressed the paper against her chest and sobbed. The truth was undeniable, the revelation both devastating and illuminating. For Ethan, it was a second chance he had never expected. For Grace, it was the confirmation of a truth that changed everything. And yet, strangely, nothing at all. Danny was still her boy, but now he was Ethan's too. And in that tangled truth, the fragile hope of a new beginning flickered to life. The DNA results changed everything, and yet changed nothing. Danny was still the boy who filled the house with sketches and laughter, still the child Grace had raised since the day Laura died. But now Ethan saw him through a different lens, no longer just Grace's nephew, but his son. The knowledge struck him with equal parts awe and guilt, a reminder of what he had missed and what he could not afford to lose again. One evening, after Danny had gone to bed, Ethan found Grace in the kitchen rinsing dishes. Her shoulders were tense, her movements brisk, as if the steady rhythm of cleaning could keep her from unraveling. He stepped closer, voice quiet. "Grace, I've spoken with colleagues. Danny's leg can be repaired. It'll take surgery and physical therapy, but he could walk without pain. Run. Play like other boys. I want to cover all of it, the surgery, the recovery, everything." Grace's hands stilled in the sink. She looked over her shoulder, eyes wide and conflicted. "Ethan, that's too much. I can't let you do that." "You can," he countered gently, "and you should. He's my responsibility now, too. I can give him what he needs." Her lips trembled as she turned back to the sink. "I'm grateful. You don't know how much. But this isn't just about money or medicine. This is about him, about us. Things are complicated enough already. I don't want him caught in a tug of war." Ethan stepped closer, his voice firmer. "There won't be a tug of war. You've raised him. You've given him everything you could. That doesn't change. But Grace, he deserves more than what life has handed him so far, and I can give it to him. Please let me." The sincerity in his tone softened something in her, but the walls she had built around herself remained. Grace nodded faintly, as though agreeing only because fighting further would break her. "We'll see," she whispered. Days blurred into weeks. Preparations began for Danny's procedure, consultations scheduled, forms signed. Ethan handled the logistics with the precision of a surgeon and the urgency of a father. Grace helped, but with each passing day she seemed more withdrawn, weighed down by unspoken thoughts. Then came the night that shifted everything. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls. Grace stood by the window in her room, staring out at the Houston skyline, its lights glittering against the dark. Ethan knocked softly before stepping inside. He meant only to reassure her, to remind her she wasn't alone in this. But when their eyes met, something fragile cracked open between them. She whispered, "Laura should be here, not me. She should be the one raising him. Every time I look at Danny, I see her face. And now you." Her voice broke, thick with guilt. "How can I not feel like I've stolen something from her?" Ethan crossed the room, stopping just close enough for her to feel his presence. "Grace, you didn't steal him. You saved him. Without you, Danny wouldn't have survived. You carried him through when no one else could. Laura would have wanted that." Her eyes filled with tears, and before either of them could think, the distance closed. His hand brushed her cheek, her breath caught, and then his lips found hers in a kiss that was hesitant, searching, filled with years of loneliness and suppressed longing. For a fleeting moment, Grace let herself lean into it, let herself feel what it meant to be wanted, not as a caretaker, not as a shadow of her sister, but as herself. But when the kiss broke, reality crashed down. She stepped back quickly, pressing her hands to her mouth. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't do this. Not with you. Not with her memory between us." "Grace," Ethan began, but she shook her head, tears spilling. "I need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't let this turn into something it shouldn't be." He caught her hand before she could pull away. "If you leave, that won't change what's already true. Danny is my son, and whether you're here or not, I will be there for him. I won't walk away again. Not from him. Not from you." The determination in his voice held her frozen. She saw no hesitation in his eyes, no fear, only conviction. Slowly, she sank into a chair, her body trembling from the clash of guilt and longing. Ethan knelt before her, his hand still holding hers. "We'll figure this out," he said softly, "even if it takes time, even if it hurts. But I'm not letting go of either of you." In that moment, Grace realized that what frightened her most wasn't Ethan's resolve. It was the part of her heart that wanted to believe him. Danny's surgery was scheduled at Houston Methodist, the same hospital where Ethan's reputation carried weight in every corridor. On the morning of the procedure, Grace sat at her son's bedside, clutching his hand as nurses prepared him. Ethan moved with calm authority, reassuring both of them even though his heart pounded harder than it ever had before any operation of his own. The hours stretched endlessly. Grace paced the waiting room, whispering prayers under her breath, while Ethan stood beside her, every muscle taut with restrained anxiety. Finally, the doors opened, and the lead surgeon, one of Ethan's trusted colleagues, approached with a smile. "The operation was a success. He'll need physical therapy, but your boy's going to walk without pain." Grace broke down in tears of relief, pressing her hands to her face. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her as her body trembled. For the first time, she didn't pull away. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Danny took his first steps with the help of crutches, his face scrunched in determination as Grace and Ethan encouraged him. Each day, he grew stronger, pushing through the exercises with a resilience that filled Ethan with pride. They clapped and cheered when Danny managed a few steps unaided, and the boys' laughter echoed through the rehabilitation room like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was during one of those evenings, when Danny had finally fallen asleep after a long day of therapy, that Ethan found Grace on the patio, her face lifted to the warm Houston night. He stepped beside her, the quiet between them charged with all that had passed. "Grace," he said softly, "I need to tell you something I can't keep inside any longer." She turned, her eyes wary but open. "I don't just want to be part of Danny's life," Ethan continued. "I want to be part of yours. These weeks, they've shown me something I didn't know I was missing. A family, a home. You and Danny, you filled this house with something I can't imagine living without. I love you, Grace. I want us to build a life together, not out of obligation, but because I choose you." Grace's lips parted, her breath catching. The confession struck deep, awakening both longing and fear. "Ethan," she whispered, "I don't know if I can. It feels wrong sometimes, as if I'm betraying Laura's memory. She should have been here with you, not me." Ethan took her hands gently in his. "Laura is gone, and nothing can change that. But she left us Danny, and you carried him when no one else could. You gave him love, a home, everything. That doesn't diminish her memory, it honors it. And I know if she could see us now, she would be grateful for you. For us." Tears filled Grace's eyes, but this time they weren't only of sorrow. She let herself lean into his embrace, and for the first time, she didn't resist the warmth she felt there. Weeks later, when Danny had regained enough strength, Ethan decided it was time to take the next step. He invited Grace and Danny to meet his parents, two people who had once been distant in his life, but who had always respected his choices. They gathered at his parents' home, a stately brick house in one of Houston's quieter suburbs. Grace was visibly nervous, smoothing her dress again and again, but Ethan kept a reassuring hand at her back. When they walked in, his mother's eyes lit up. "So this is Grace and Danny. Welcome." His father, reserved but kind, shook her hand firmly and bent down to greet Danny with a smile. The evening unfolded with surprising warmth. Grace relaxed as Ethan's mother complimented her cooking when she described the meal she prepared, and his father praised Danny's courage in therapy. Laughter filled the dining room, weaving the threads of something that felt like belonging. It was near the end of dinner, with everyone gathered around the table, that Ethan stood. He cleared his throat, nerves visible even in his composed demeanor. Grace looked up, startled, as he reached into his pocket and drew out a small velvet box. "Grace," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "from the moment you and Danny came into my life, everything changed. You gave me more than companionship. You gave me a family. I don't want to imagine a future without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Grace gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The room fell into hushed silence, eyes shining with anticipation. Danny leaned forward, his grin wide and hopeful. For a long, trembling second, Grace couldn't find her voice. Then tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "Yes, yes, Ethan, I will." Applause and cheers erupted around the table. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, and Grace let herself fall into his arms, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and joy. Danny wrapped his arms around them both, laughing through his own tears. For the first time in years, Grace felt the weight of grief lifting. What had begun as an arrangement born of chance had blossomed into something neither of them had expected. A true family. The wedding was nothing extravagant, just as Grace had wished. They chose a small chapel on the outskirts of Houston, where the stained glass windows glowed with afternoon light and the air was filled with the fragrance of lilies. Friends, colleagues, and family gathered, not hundreds, but enough to make the room feel alive with warmth. Grace walked down the aisle in a simple ivory dress, her hand trembling slightly until her eyes found Ethan waiting at the altar. His gaze held steady, filled with a love that had taken root in the most unexpected of circumstances. Danny sat in the front pew, his face glowing with pride. When the vows were spoken and the rings exchanged, he was the first to clap, his voice ringing out above the rest. "That's my dad," he cried, his smile so wide it lit up the entire chapel. The laughter and applause that followed made Grace's tears spill freely. Ethan knelt down in front of Danny and opened his arms, and the boy ran to him without hesitation. For the first time, Danny called him Dad, not in practice or pretense, but with joy and certainty. The reception was modest but joyful. Tables laid with homemade dishes, music that encouraged even the most reserved guests to dance, and laughter that spilled long into the evening. Grace felt as though she were floating, the girl who had once huddled on a cold bench outside a supermarket, now standing in the center of a life she never thought possible. Weeks later, Ethan kept his promise of a honeymoon, taking Grace to Paris. It wasn't about luxury or spectacle. It was about standing on cobblestone streets together, hand in hand, looking out over the Seine at night while the Eiffel Tower shimmered against the sky. For Ethan, the city was a symbol of starting over, of savoring each moment instead of letting life slip past in the blur of long hours and empty rooms. For Grace, Paris was proof that she belonged in a world she had once thought forever closed to her. They strolled through art galleries, shared quiet meals in sidewalk cafes, and let themselves breathe in the rhythm of a city built on beauty and resilience. On their final night, as they sat watching the lights flicker across the river, Grace leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder. "I never thought happiness could look like this," she whispered. "It's only the beginning," Ethan said, his hand resting protectively over hers. When they returned to Houston, life unfolded with even more joy. Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news came quietly, an appointment, a smile from the doctor, a slip of paper confirming what she already suspected. She shared it with Ethan one evening at home, slipping the test results across the table with nervous hands. He read them, blinked, and then looked up with a grin that broke into unrestrained laughter. He stood, lifting her into his arms, twirling her around the kitchen like a man who had just been given the world. Danny burst into the room at the commotion, and when they told him he was going to be a big brother, he jumped with delight. "A sister!" he exclaimed, already imagining the role. The months passed in a blur of preparations, nursery colors, tiny clothes, doctor's visits. Grace carried the baby with the kind of peace she had never known before, supported every step by Ethan and cheered on by Danny, who took his job as protector very seriously. But amidst the joy, there was one more thing to be done. On a cool autumn morning, Ethan, Grace, and Danny drove to the cemetery where Laura rested. Grace carried a bouquet of fresh lilies, Danny a small bundle of wildflowers he had picked himself. They stood together before the simple headstone, the silence heavy but not unbearable. Grace knelt, placing the flowers gently at her sister's grave. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I kept my promise, Laura. He's safe. He's loved. And now we're building a family that will carry you with us always." Ethan rested his hand on Grace's shoulder, his other hand holding Danny's. The boy looked up at the stone, then at the two adults who now stood as his parents, and whispered, "Thank you, Aunt Laura." The three of them stood together in that moment, bound by grief but also by love. The past had taken much from them, loss, loneliness, years they could never reclaim. But it had also led them here, to each other, to a future that glowed with promise. As they turned to leave, Grace slipped her hand into Ethan's, Danny clinging to the other. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow across the cemetery, as if blessing the new chapter they were stepping into. From loss had come love, from heartbreak, healing, and from the memory of one life ended, a new family had been born, whole, united, and unshakably strong.